Aloha. Aloha. Aloha, Kumu. It's my honor and pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. Mahalo to you and mahalo to everyone listening. So my name is Brandon Kamahana Kealoha. I want to start this segment off with a prayer composed by the Queen Liliuokalani while she was under house arrest at Iolani Palace after the overthrow. O ko aloha no aia I kalani a o ko oia I o he hemolele hoi. Ko unoho mihi ana a paahau ia o oi ku'ulama. Ko nani ko uko'o. Mai nā ino ino. Na hewa o kanaka. A ka e hui kala. A mae no. No laila e ka haku malalo o ko e heu. Ko maluhia. A mauloa aku no. Amen. In English, this means, it's a prayer, and this is what it means. Your loving mercy is as high as heaven, and your truth so perfect. I live in sorrow, imprisoned. You are my light, your glory my support. Behold not with malevolence the sins of man, but forgive and cleanse. And so, O Lord, protect us beneath your wings, and let peace be our portion now and forevermore. Amen. Amen. Excuse me. That was a prayer composed by the Queen while she was imprisoned and her government wrongfully overthrown by the descendants of American missionaries. They called themselves the annexation. Well, they called themselves the Committee of Safety, but they really became known as the Annexation Club. They were part Hawaiian nationals and part American nationals. And in their unlawful coup and in the overthrow, they petitioned the United States military to send their warships to back them up, claiming under false pretense that American lives were in danger. They used that military might of America to point their cannons and guns to and at the palace and imprison our queen in a tiny room on the top floor towards the Honolulu side of the palace. So today, we are going to talk about the current political status of the Kingdom of Hawaii. The Kingdom of Hawaii, in our mother tongue, is Ko Hawai'i Pai Aina, what they call themselves. It means the Kingdom of Hawaii. So how did it all begin? Well, the overthrow is a result of strategic and insidious planning by these Hawaii nationals, kingdom subjects supposedly, with the goal to annex the islands of Hawaii excuse me, to the United States, their motherland. in this goal, they breached international law, and what continues today is the occupation of Hawaii. In order for one country to acquire another country, according to international law, a treaty must be entered into by both parties and agreed upon. And then on the American side, if they're incorporating another nation or another territory into the Union, they have to have that ratified in their legislature, approved, in order for this to happen. None of this has happened for the Kingdom of Hawaii. In a failed attempt to get annexation, which would require the permission of the legal government and the agreement of America, they bitterly failed in the proposition for a treaty of annexation, which they deliberated for many, many months on the legislature floor of the American Congress. What later happens is they pass a unilateral joint resolution, in other words, an agreement of a nation upon itself and by itself to acquire the islands and the Kingdom of Hawaii. According to international law, this is unlawful. A treaty must exist in order for this to be legal. Yeah, and this is one of the many reasons, besides the obvious reason, the Queen didn't enter into war. There's certain actions that, according to international law, designate you as having agreed to enter into war. We had an absolutely peaceful overthrow by command of the Queen. There was insurgency, but it didn't reach a high level of violence or anything like that. There was large protests continuously from the beginning of the overthrow to today. And the Kingdom of Hawaii has never agreed to annexation. Let me, I have some documents I'd like to share. Is that okay, Kumu? Or I can share them after. I can just go from it, what I have here now. But I did want to share these documents with you. One's entitled Darkness Over Hawaii, The Annexation Myth is the Greatest Obstacle to Progress, composed by Dr. Williamson Chang. And he is a professor at the law school at the University of Hawaii. And I wanted to go through his entire treatment of the subject. So I'm going to read some, I'm going to talk some, and I'm going to go through these links and documents that I hope to be able to share with you eventually. So maybe I can either give you the link after or post the link here if that's okay. But just let me know. So the world, particularly the United States of America, is deeply ignorant about the history of Hawaii. In 1897, the U.S. failed to ratify a treaty to acquire Hawaii. A year later, the U.S. turned to legislation, a joint resolution of Congress to annex Hawaii. There is a pervasive belief among Americans that Hawaii was acquired by this joint resolution of Congress in 1898, and thus is presently the territory and the state of the U.S. This is the official view of the U.S. with respect to the status of Hawaii. Based on this claim, the U.S. exercises sovereignty and jurisdiction over the Hawaiian Islands as American territory, right? What Williamson is trying to show us is that these claims are false. Since 1898, the governments of the U.S. and the state of Hawaii have deliberately misled the people of Hawaii, the U.S., and the world. Current scholarship in Hawaii is proving these claims false. Yet the grip of a century of deception, denationalization, and deliberate ignorance of the obvious reaches far and deep into American and Hawaiian society. The destruction of this falsehood is the most important next step for Native Hawaiians, because even we believe the farce and the illusion. But there are particular, specific laws that nations have agreed upon, international law, that require a treaty in order to absorb another nation. Yeah. Annexation was strongly opposed in 1898 during the Senate debate. Majority of the Senate did not want Hawaii at all to be part of the United States. That debate came to be known as the Great Debate to Save the Older America. Yet those American voices of opposition in 1898 have long been forgotten. Despite being such a major event, the debate over annexation and the views of those who stood in opposition have virtually disappeared from American history. They strongly opposed the annexation of Hawaii. Most people assume that the restoration of the Native Hawaiian government is so slim, a possibility that seeking truth is an exercise in futility. That's how our mentality has been trained. So many Native Hawaiians, I don't like to use that term, kanaka uivi is better, are willing to accept the status quo, while some favor the alternative, all right? Native Hawaiians, kanaka uivi, are just now learning the true status of the Hawaiian Islands. So you're not the only one learning it if this is new to you. The joint resolution was incapable of acquiring Hawaii because only a treaty could annex Hawaii. Now, the Treaty of 1897 was never ratified by the United States. An annexation by a joint resolution was unconstitutional. Some of the representatives in the Congress of the time said that annexing by resolution would destroy the integrity of the Constitution and undermine the basis of the American Republic. And this is why. Joint resolution is unilateral, it's municipal, it's a law made within a nation upon itself. Laws that nations make in their legislatures or the parliament or what have you are only have jurisdiction within the borders of that nation. So as much as Hawaii couldn't make a law that said something like, oh, we decide that we're going to annex Great Britain all on their own, neither could America lawfully do the same to Hawaii. Yeah. So, and they knew this was international law, that a treaty was required. Many Hawaiians were opposed to annexation during the debate on the joint resolution. Many representatives and senators were opposed to the joint resolution. So how did this come to pass? So the speeches of the U.S. senators that oppose the acquisition of Hawaii as a territory through annexation first, and then later through the resolution, are very strong. They mostly denounce it. Let me read some of what their criticism was. Does the Constitution provide Congress the power to annex a foreign nation through a joint resolution rather than a treaty? There is nothing in the Constitution that prohibits Congress from annexing a foreign state through the means of a joint resolution. If the joint resolution is passed through both the U.S. House and Senate, then signed by the President, it went through a process. That's the excuse they're using today to ignore international law. That's the excuse they give us. This is from Judge Scalia, who I think he's still alive and he's on the Supreme Court. He implied that Hawaii was just another colony of Spain and taken in the Spanish-American War, like the Philippines and Puerto Rico. But the fact is, Hawaii was not a colony of Spain. It was an independent nation recognized among the family of nations, and their sovereignty was through treaty internationally recognized and upheld. Justice Scalia is clearly wrong on all points. Okay, I'm telling you the argument that people give us, that hey, it was part of the Spanish acquisition during the Spanish War, and erroneously it has been said that a joint resolution is a acceptable means of annexing another country. Basically, that's a country deciding upon itself without the input of the other country to go ahead and occupy another country. And that's illegal according to international law, unless you're in war. To be in war, you have to commit acts of war. It's very specific according to international law. Now, the Kingdom of Hawaii has never committed an act of war throughout its entire occupation. The act of war committed by the United States was landing foreign troops on our kingdom grounds, and when their boots touch the ground is when the act of war is committed. Not to mention taking hostage our government and our mo'i, our head of state. This is what some of the senators said that were opposed to the annexation and opposed to the joint resolution. A joint resolution, if passed, becomes a statute law. It has no other or greater force. It is the same as if it would be if it were entitled an act instead of a joint resolution. That's the deception right there, that there was a resolution and it was joint. There was no joint resolution. There was no joint agreement, and there was no resolution. That is its legal classification, an act. It is therefore impossible for the government of the United States to reach across its boundary into the dominion of another government and annex that government or persons or property therein. But the United States may do so under the treaty making power, which I shall hereafter consider. That's Senator Allen of the 1898 legislature of America. How can a joint resolution such as this be operative? What is the legislative jurisdiction of Congress? Does it extend over Hawaii? May we in this anticipatory manner reach out beyond the sea and assert our authority under a resolution of Congress within the confines of that independent nation? Where is our right, our grant of power to do this? Where do we find it? Some assume to discover it in the supposition that there has been a cessation. That means an agreement, a treaty, to become part of America, which has in truth never been made. So they acknowledge that on the Senate floor. Hawaii is foreign to us. We base our jurisdiction upon a falsehood desired to be made conclusive in a resolution, the verity of which is said cannot be attacked, however groundless it may be. Another thing we want to look at for this very specific political disposition I'm talking about of Hawaii being unlawfully and illegally occupied by the United States military in a prolonged, continuous, and current occupation since 1893, well 1898 if you want to be technical, is the state of the Hawaiian Kingdom, ko Hawaii Pai'aina. If the President of the United States could do it for Hawaii, one of the senators say on the floor, then why can't he do it for Jamaica or Germany or Russia? Congress was not given the power to annex a foreign state, except in the admission of that nation as a state. Under the law of the equal sovereignty of states, that's an international law too, one independent and sovereign nation such as the United States cannot take another nation, such as Hawaii, by means or its own legislative act. That's why it's important that we did not engage in the act of war, not just to save Hawaiian lives, because we were definitely on the losing end of the stick. The United States military at that time was the most technologically, and still is, most technologically advanced navy. They had the most technologically advanced navy in the world. So their cannons and their gunfire that they brought to Hawaii would have instantly overpowered our rifles and bayonets, I think is the most we have, and our turn of the century cannons. See, they had modern weapons when they came here, so even more so. Senators opposed to annexation stood fast not only on the proposition that the joint resolution had no power to acquire Hawaii, but also on the fact that the use of a joint resolution in place of a treaty was unconstitutional. So they knew this, they discussed this, they debated this, they rejected the annexation, the attempt to annex Hawaii. Two propositions are explained by, is it Justice Scalia? In the constitutionality of annexation by joint resolution. First, that the territory can only be annexed or acquired by treaty. That's according to the international laws that America has agreed to abide by. Second, that the president under the Constitution may occupy the Hawaiian Islands under the war power and by virtue of his office as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy. So that's where they get a little foot in as to taking action, but they don't fulfill the requirement of a treaty. And they knew it was unconstitutional to acquire a foreign nation by a joint resolution. They explicitly stated over and over again in the debates. Doing so, having used the joint resolution as a fake treaty to acquire Hawaii, undermines the Constitution's carefully allocated powers. Enacting a joint resolution requires a mere majority of the Senate House. But really accepting a territory as a state requires a majority vote, a 2/3 majority vote. So they also sidestep their own constitution and have just a regular majority, not a 2/3 majority vote. And that's how the resolution was passed. It was because of this 2/3 requirement that the McKinley administration decides to go with a joint resolution, because the annexation proposition failed. If Hawaii is to be annexed, according to Senator Bacon of the time, it ought certainly to be annexed by constitutional method. And if by constitutional method it cannot be annexed, no senator ought to desire its annexation. Moreover, Senator Allen of Nebraska added, but as respects the treaty-making power, the president is authorized to open negotiations with foreign countries and enter into treaties of all kinds, subject to the right of the states, as represented in this chamber, to approve or reject. So it has to be ratified and approved too, which never happened with the joint resolution. It was a one-sided agreement. They say that there's a whole bunch of treaties that add up to the displacement of Hawaii. So besides not having the annexation treaty and propositioning an internal law to acquire an external foreign nation, when the Queen was held hostage and taken by gunpoint to her room or prison in the palace, she, after so many days, comes up with this treaty that she's going to proposition America, knowing that there are the sons of missionaries that overthrew her, knowing that they acquired America's explicit help in doing that, and that was the main reason why they were allowed into the country, and this was allowed to occur from the Hawaiian side. She composes this treaty, and it is a treaty, abdicating her powers and the Kingdom of Hawaii as a sovereign to the United States of America, but with the stipulation that this was a mistake, and that when America realizes its mistake, because it's obvious to those who know international law that no treaty was there, that America is required to give back the sovereignty of Hawaii. So she trusted America to come to a point of justice. But because of the change of administration to McKinley, and because of the Spanish War, even though America failed to annex Hawaii lawfully, they become a desire for Hawaii becomes more and more prevalent and manifest status quo. And so the powers that be decide to make a law upon itself, to decide, hey, we're the United States, we're gonna annex Hawaii, using those words, annex, using the words ceded and cessation, but you cannot use those words without a treaty of annexation. but they're purposely using these words to seem like they're conforming to international law. So the evidence also lies in the cover-up of America knowingly committing these crimes. It's not something that just happened and they didn't know about it. They explicitly debate each other, very heated, and say that this is illegal. The things we found out today, they knew already in 1898. So that's important to point out too. Let me see if I can go forward a little bit. So the second agreement is when America does take the Queen's treaty and agrees to abide by it, and then never does. To this day, never does. Yeah, and the way they have been able to do that is by not acknowledging and not processing the full requirement of the treaty, which is stated explicitly that until such time as America realizes it's wrong, and then will return Hawaii to its rightful sovereign state. Yeah. They just pretty much took the treaty and ignored it, but took the part of the treaty that they wanted, which was the kingdom and the lands. That was their justification, because the Queen had abdicated. But they leave out the complete treaty and contract, the part where America is supposed to return Hawaii to its sovereign status. It's really unfortunate that this is the case. It really does, like the senators say, put a dark cloud over the United States Constitution itself, because this is in violation of the Constitution, and here's why. There's something called the Supremacy Clause, and with the Supremacy Clause, it explicitly states that treaties are the law above all other laws in the land. That includes the Constitution itself. So what a treaty says should be upheld according to the Constitution itself. And so they're in violation not of only international law, and of course Hawaiian law, but their own United States constitutional law. Yeah. Some of the evidences include the wordage in this resolution. So the joint resolution starts America's mentality that it's going to acquire Hawaii. And how it acquires Hawaii is to the Newfoundlands resolution. They create another resolution. And in this other resolution, they basically seem to give themselves the islands in a treaty. But again, it's a resolution upon themselves. They're basically giving themselves a foreign land. And what's lacking in this resolution, the Newfoundlands resolution, which is supposedly designates the islands and the seaways and the territory of Hawaii and all its lands, conveying it to America. But this is the trick of the Newlands resolution. In it, it states explicitly that all the lands and boundaries and meats and islands and seaways of the territory of Hawaii. Now, because Hawaii was overthrown, the new government that came up was a quasi pseudo government, not a legal, lawful government. They were the leaders of the coup. They called themselves the provisional government, is what they called themselves. And only because they planned to be temporary in order to convey Hawaii to America in a farce or illusion of a lawful avenue. What happens is, because they overthrew the government, they never received the land, this provisional government. They didn't have the title to these lands, and therefore they couldn't put the metes and bounds in the Newfoundland resolution. America knew that if they did put the metes and bounds in there, that any other country among the family of countries. They hold up international law. They're the precursor to the United Nations, the family of nations. They knew that any one of the countries among the family of nations could at any time demand proof of this conveyance of lands and waterways. And so they do not explicitly put it in the Newfoundland's resolution. And because it's not in the resolution, what the current government, the United States of America, accepts as conveyance is that of the territory of Hawaii, which is the precursor of the provisional government. The provisional government never had the land conveyed to them in the first place. So there are no metes and bounds like there are in every single application for statehood, for every single territory, in every single land deed, common to the government land deed in America. You have to have a survey that says this much to that much longitude, this much to that much latitude, all the way up to the top of the mountain there, and then back again this many feet to, it describes the borders of the land conveyance. Exactly the total amount of land, exactly where the borders are. The state of Hawaii does not have that because they get their authority from the territory of Hawaii, which gets its authority from the provisional government of Hawaii, which overthrew the lawful kingdom and never received these lands for conveyance in clear title. So it still belongs to the Kingdom of Hawaii, lawfully, legally, and recognized by international law. When the provisional government pretends to convey it to the territory of Hawaii, there's actually no land in the provision. There's no metes and bounds. There's no islands. There's no waterways. They just kind of say the aforementioned lands of Hawaii and waterways without the metes and bounds, and that's because they never got the conveyance. They continue to pass it on to the territory that way, and the state of Hawaii refers to the acquisition of Hawaii's lands, waterways as the lands that belong to the territory of Hawaii. So they explicitly state that in the laws that so-called make Hawaii a state. So that's a blaring inconsistency. They don't have the metes and bounds. Along with that was the cover-up of removing Palmyra from the Hawaiian Kingdom's assets. That's the island of Palmyra. Now they do this by erroneously stating that the Northern Hawaiian Islands and Palmyra won't be included in the state of Hawaii. That's because the military wanted to take it for itself. But really, it's just a excuse to exclude Palmyra from the whole of the islands, so that the military can have its way and bomb and do whatever it does. In 1959. And mind you, according to international law, if you are unlawfully, illegally occupied, then number one, you did not commit an act of war, but you have act of war committed against you. So you're a peaceful nation, and that makes international law protect you, as an occupied, specifically occupied, unlawfully nation. The federal description of boundaries is a condition of statehood. It's required by the United States Constitution that boundaries be part of your submission. And it's not. It's just not part of the submission process. The people of Hawaii were told that the change in boundaries in 1959 was on the ballot, It was merely technical and required by Congress. The people were told that the change in boundaries, that they must approve it in a question number 2 on the ballot. And it would not change the dominion of Hawaii. That was true, what they said when they said it wouldn't change the dominion of Hawaii. But what it would do is create a false conveyance with the metes and bounds, so that the state could have fulfill the requirements for statehood. So in 1959, they tried to fix that lack of metes and bounds that hasn't been fulfilled by having the people vote on it. According to international law, if a country is being unlawfully occupied, then any plebiscite held is illegal too. Not to mention that Hawaiian nationals are not allowed to vote on their own status of their country. They were required first to rescind and denounce their queen and kingdom in order to vote. If you were working in a government job, like if you were working as a police officer or a judge or a clerk in the court, to keep your job, you were required to denounce and rescind your Hawaiian nationalism and your queen. Not many Hawaiians were forced to do that, and there's a specific form that was filled out. Twice, Hawaiians were required to denounce their kingdom and nation, and twice many did not as well. So the vote, which is illegal to hold anyway by the occupying government, that was a illegal act, and so it does not count according to international law. But it also was bereft of the people of the nation who had the right to decide whether or not to join with America or to deny it. Most of the people that were kingdom subjects weren't allowed to vote, although the voting process was illegal to begin with. So it's two layers of it not being valid. The attempt to falsify a plebiscite as if we voted and had a democratic or democracy afforded to us. Never afforded. They come up with Committee Print 6. It's the title of a document with the metes and bounds of Hawaii. This was adopted by the people of Hawaii through that illegal plebiscite in 1959, which is not that long ago. According to Williamson, it was evident that no one knew what they were voting for. There was no discussion of the meaning of the new boundary description. There was no discussion or questions raised as to the exclusion of the channel waters and Palmyra by the language of Section 2 of the Admission Act. And it copied the language of Committee Print 6. After the vote, the boundary description of the state constitution was amended to track Section 2, although the state of Hawaii never followed the proper procedures for amendment as defined in the Constitution. In a very odd sense, the people of Hawaii voted for two contradictory propositions. The first proposition approved of statehood. That was the first question. In question 2, the people, without any knowledge of what they were voting for, overwhelmingly agreed, anyway, that there would be nothing in this new state. And they agreed because the language of the question number 2 stated something to the effect of the metes and bounds of the territory of Hawaii. And the territory of Hawaii has no metes and bounds because they also, yes. Oh, what happened? Was I out? What? Oh. I've been talking this whole time, so sorry. How long ago was that? The whole time? iPod. Yes. Let me see if I can summarize it. Okay, I can summarize real quick and catch up, but I talked about a lot of things. So, what's required is a treaty. A treaty has never been executed. And so because the treaty couldn't be executed, and they tried, it failed miserably, and this is required by international law, this treaty. They attempted to falsify a treaty by creating a joint resolution. A joint resolution is an internal law that only applies within the borders of the country that makes that law. It's like you making a law for your own country. And so they proceeded to falsify the requirement of a treaty with a joint resolution. So in a joint resolution, a country decides upon itself to create a law and enforce that law. And it's only enforceable within the borders of that country. What they do here is they decide to acquire Hawaii. And then they systematically begin to reach outside their borders and occupy what is in layman terms, occupy the country. So there was no agreement, in other words. There was no democracy afforded, not even in 1959, where proponents for statehood like to refer to the plebiscite in 1959, which had two questions on the ballot. I don't think you heard this yet because I was talking about that. The first question was whether or not the constituents wanted to be part of America as a state. And the second question was if they could accept the metes and bounds from the territory of Hawaii, because they had no metes and bounds. Practically, what essentially happened is there was no land, there was no waterways conveyed in metes and bounds through any kind of instrument up until this point in 1959. And it's required by the United States Constitution for the process of statehood that metes and bounds are conveyed. Yeah. So in 1959, you could only vote if you denounced your kingdom and your queen, and you officially denounced them. You have to sign a paper and go in front of like a notary public and have another witness. And that witness, a lot of Hawaiians refused to do that. The only ones who did were the ones coerced, and they were all coerced, but more coerced. More coercion occurred for those that were government workers for the kingdom government, or policemen and judges, for example. They would lose their jobs as well if they did not denounce their queen and their nation. So you can imagine how difficult that could be for some loyalists, which was mostly every Hawaiian. The only people that did it, like I said, were people that had to keep their jobs, that were coerced because of that, because of losing their job. And so the people of Hawaii did not get to vote on this. And even if they did, according to international law, when one country is unlawfully occupying another country, they are not allowed to hold plebiscites. The plebiscites don't count. But in this plebiscite, they attempted to further falsify an annexation of Hawaii. They still say the word annexation. It never occurred. You need to have a treaty. A treaty is an agreement between two sovereign nations, or two sovereigns, I should say. Never happened. The joint resolution is a law made within the borders of America by the legislature that attempts to falsify a treaty. In fact, they call it a treaty. And the title joint resolution is deceptive as well, as if there was a joint resolution. It was a unilateral resolution. There was no consulting of the party that was involved, whose lands and kingdom and nationality was going to be destroyed or taken. According to international law, that entity must agree to this treaty in order to cede lands lawfully, convey them lawfully, in order for any entity to become a state. And on America's side, the Constitution requires metes and bounds to be part of that agreement. And all it said about borders and land area or ocean acquisition, the area of Hawaii, was that it takes reference to the territory of Hawaii for those metes and bounds. And the territory of Hawaii, again, never acquired the kingdom, and therefore never had metes and bounds conveyed to them in any kind of instrument. So basically it carries on to America not really having any of the islands, any of the waterways properly conveyed. So there's no land in this, technically no land in this self-agreement, agreement upon itself, themselves. And there's no waterways. So to fix that, they tried to have a plebiscite, first asking if statehood was what the constituents wanted, and second, trying to falsify the meets and bounds issue that was not, they were bereft. They did not have to fulfill the rules of how an entity becomes a state according to the U.S. Constitution now. So we're going between laws of international law, we're going between laws of the United States Constitution and Hawaiian Kingdom law. They knew this because they tried to cover it up. And how they tried to cover it up, they call the joint resolution a joint resolution, first of all. They attempt to... am I here, guys? Am I still here? Just want to check. Okay, cool. They try to fulfill the requirement for a treaty with the joint resolution. They start calling it a treaty, which it is not. A treaty is an agreement between two parties and two sovereigns. That is not what this is. They also, upon renaming Honolulu High School McKinley High School, which is still named today, and we're trying to change that, they commissioned a statue built, and on this statue, or part of this statue, is McKinley holding a treaty of annexation, which does not exist. Not anywhere in the archives of Hawaii do they have a treaty of annexation. And the only annexation attempt was promptly and efficiently denied when it went to the Congress. The resolution comes about because they decide, oh my gosh, we're in the Spanish War now. Maybe Hawaii will be a great place to pivot and have a base in the Pacific to refuel. And that's where the idea of the joint resolution came about, because they tried twice, I think, to annex Hawaii prior to that, and failed each time. One time, most of the reasoning that was given was because most of the Senate didn't want it to happen. They called it illegal, unlawful, against international laws. Everything I'm telling you, they already knew. They knew they needed a treaty. They didn't have a treaty. They knew the people of Hawaii didn't want to as a majority, because the people of Hawaii miraculously got together in a time with no telephone and no internet, no technology, to garner 95% of the nation's subjects to oppose in writing the annexation of Hawaii. And the Senate knew this. So the Senate, knowing this, denied both attempts at annexation. So those conspiring, those Americans who really believed in manifest destiny, that was their mantra, they deserved to acquire lands of indigenous peoples and whatnot. They conspired this joint resolution. Now, for a annexation treaty, you would have to have a 2/3 vote of the Congress, which is like a larger majority vote than just a mere majority. But for a resolution, you only needed a simple majority. Does that make sense? So that they only had 51% vote or so. They didn't receive a 2/3 vote, in other words, which is a requirement of the process of statehood. So they sidestepped that as well, fabricating the fact that they had a treaty, using the resolution as a treaty, fabricating the conveyance of lands, using the territory of Hawaii's so-called acquisition of lands as a precedent for what lands they're assuming they own. And these are all the waterways, every single island, and so far away from the reef is where they go with the meets and bounds. So they held a plebiscite to falsify the meets and bounds. The people voted on it. That process, any plebiscite by an occupying government within the occupied government, is illegal according to international law. So it just continues. They just continue to try to cover up the fact that nothing was conveyed, not sovereignty, not lands, not by democracy and want of the people. I think that basically sums it up. So today we remain under a prolonged occupation, under a military occupation since the boots landed and pointed their guns to the palace, and the people of Hawaii have a very unique position where, for example, why do you think those people in Haiti and in Puerto Rico put their babies in rafts and pushed them out into the ocean just in hope that they would land in America and then have American citizenship. Yeah. Some people in Mexico are digging complex tunnels that they risk their lives trying to cross the border every day. Nobody told them that they can just wake up one day and be American, because that's how we did it. We just woke up one day and all of a sudden we were told we were American. So there's people risking their lives of their children in Puerto Rico and in Cuba and all those areas trying to get to America on this makeshift rafts, like really risking their lives, facing gunfire, facing human trafficking, facing all kinds of adversities to get into the countries, because they know that once the child arrives, they have a better chance at being a citizen. They know that if they get here and they give birth, that child will be an American citizen. There's rules, because there's rules that make you an American citizen. Nobody except Kanaka Oiwi woke up Americans. Like, I feel like we should tell these people, like, are you being silly? Why are you putting your baby's life at risk? You just gotta go sleep and you wake up in the morning and you're American. No, that's not how it works. But they covered up the lack of naturalization for all of the subjects of the Hawaiian kingdom by creating more statute. And now remember, these laws are only enforceable within the borders of the nation that made them. And so they're still enforcing laws outside of their borders in an occupied kingdom that they occupy. And in this, they've redefined what a Hawaiian is, which is one of the characteristics of genocide. When you destroy, with intent to destroy, national identity, that's considered genocide, according to the United Nations. You can look it up yourself. When you cut off a people from their subsistence, like their lands and their agricultural resources and their fisheries and their hunting grounds, you're committing genocide. There's the kosher idea of genocide. You're murdering people in mass, yeah. But these other two are also qualifications for genocide, when one nation or entity enacts policies to exterminate another nation and a national identity, which is exactly what is happening to Hawaiians today and throughout since 1898, being forcibly removed from the lands that they own in clear title, their land deeds not being recognized by the law that occupies us, even though on paper it's recognized. The statutes, Hawaii statutes, state that all legal decisions today take the Hawaiian Kingdom courts as precedent for today's law. But what they've done to avoid having to fulfill that statement, and uphold the Hawaiian Kingdom law, is they will dismiss any of our cases if we bring a case against them in their court. They refuse to hear it. Yeah. The Supreme Court has rationalized that because the territory of Hawaii has conveyed their metes and bounds, which there was nothing in their metes and bounds for the territory of Hawaii as well, that somehow America magically inherits the 1.4 million acres of crown and government lands that we have politicized to the max today. There's a lot of trouble with that. And effectively occupied and taken the seats of our government and the assets of our government. They claim, because of international law, they don't want to seem like they're violating it, that they're holding it in trust, and that the territory of Hawaii gave them Hawaii willingly, and that's not true either. They very willfully rejected annexation as well. The provisional government that overthrew the Queen eventually, they didn't like the deal. So the only way America is here is by force, against international law, against the constitutional law, which requires a treaty, and to the deprivation of the Hawaiian people, enacting genocidal policies. Like, for example, we weren't allowed to speak Hawaiian, not as a law that was enacted, but as a regulation that was enacted in all halls of education. Yeah, and people were beaten for speaking Hawaiian. So it was stigmatized to the max, and it was enforced through regulation, and that's a large reason why we don't have our language today. That's a genocidal act as well, stamping out an ethnicity's culture as well. So we qualify under three characteristics of genocide as this being a genocide. We qualify as this being an unlawful illegal occupation because there is no treaty. And so the political disposition of Kanaka today, we see it manifesting in all kinds of what people can consider, we call it ku'e, like to rebel, like to stand steadfast, to block the roads, to cause disruption, to stand against. That's what ku'e means, yeah. And we see it all the time. We see it when homeless Hawaiians are referencing the fact that we have 1.4 million acres, yet we are the largest population of homeless in Hawaii, while they claim to be a trust that holds that land in trust for us. Hawaiians go homeless, and while they claim to hold that land in trust for us, they lease it out to telescopes, the military, private businesses, hotels, apartment buildings, the airports, the malls, and Hawaiians go homeless. Now, put it in perspective. There's 1.4 million acres. There's approximately 500,000 Hawaiians today. That's a real asset that could be useful for the homeless Hawaiians that are tied up in a farce of a trust. To create a trust, you need the beneficiaries of the trust to convey, explicitly give in contract and in metes and bounds too, this being land, their asset to the trust, right? That never happened. So it's a theft. The thief is still here in the house and claiming to be a trustee. And what's the difference between lawful and legal come to mind here? Yeah, what is lawful and what is legal? There's a huge definition for both, and it's not this simple, but I've simplified it for my use here. And Williamson Chang agrees. So lawful can be seen like as agreements are made in treaties. Those are laws. Yeah. When you make an agreement in a treaty, that becomes an international law. According to the Constitution, these laws are above all laws within the country, including the Constitution itself, according to what's called the Supremacy Clause. The treaties that America has with the Kingdom of Hawaii are friendly treaties recognizing our sovereignty, agreeing to protect that sovereignty, and agreeing to step in if that sovereignty is threatened. That's how friendly countries associate with each other. And then, after that's established in a treaty, then they go for what they really want to go for, like some kind of trade of land, some kind of lease or something, or some kind of trade agreement. But in the treaty, it explicitly states the recognition of sovereignty, the recognition of the responsibility to protect each other's sovereignty. The United States is in grave violation of their own Constitution in that way as well, because of the Supremacy Clause. The Supreme Court pretty much assumed that Hawaii was acquired during the Spanish War as a colony of Spain. This is like crazy. We've never been a colony of Spain. Nobody speaks Spanish. There was never a Spanish acquisition of Hawaii or invasion of Hawaii. I mean, they hardly even visited Hawaii. So for the Supreme Court to say that is belligerent and erroneous. And that's what we call this. We call this, it's a technical term supported by international law, a belligerent occupation. And belligerent referring to the purposeful ignorance to laws that require a treaty, laws that require a plebiscite to be done, to, to, to not be handled by an occupying government, laws that require clear title to be upheld, laws that preserve our sovereign right. And that's what the Queen was so magnificently and maybe spiritually even knowledgeable about. I mean, I can't believe how specifically she has positioned Hawaiians because of the way she wrote the treaties, because of the way she didn't engage in an act of war. If we engaged in an act of war against the United States, like they engaged in an act of war against us by landing their troops here, that's a specific act of war, recognized as an act of war. If we engaged in an act of war, then and we lost, then everything that America gains would be fair ground. But she specifically kept us as a peaceful country. She specifically reserved our sovereign right and clear title to these lands through her contract, and she specifically reserved our sovereignty from being occupied and taken away in her treaty to America. America agreed to take her abdication from the throne, and in the abdication, in the agreement, again it states that America shall be in trust of these lands and of the sovereignty of Hawaii until such day as they recognize their wrong. And then they're required to return it. And they won't hear the argument. They've covered up the crimes. They've denationalized Kanaka, subjects of the kingdom, which means they've brainwashed us to think that we are Americans. They've created legislation that also points to the crime. Like, why would they have to have a legislation that designates, this is what it says a Native Hawaiian is under the law. It says that Native Hawaiians are a blood quantum of 50% or more. So immediately disassociating 49%ers and less from being Hawaiian. They're going to be called part Hawaiians now, according to the law. Number two, descendants of those that were here when Captain Cook landed in Hawaii. Now tell me something. Does Captain Cook landing anywhere in the world constitute what an ethnicity is? And number three, what makes a Hawaiian according to these laws? Blood quantum, an American. Oh, it's an American. It says explicitly that we are Americans. Why would it have to designate that we are Americans, you think? Well, you don't have to think very far. I'll tell you. It's because we're not. Otherwise, it would state in the law that you're an American too. Because why aren't you protected by a law that states that you're American? Because you are American. You're either born here, according to the law, you're born in America, you're American soil, you're an American. But what about for Kanaka Maoli then, or Kanaka Oiwi? What is the legal basis that we are Americans? We've never been naturalized. We weren't born on American soil. Those are the only two things I can think of that make you an American: naturalization and being born on American soil. I think you can be married to an American for a certain amount of years and then be considered an American, but I'm not quite sure about that. The evidence, the smoking gun evidence, is in the enactment of the state law. You know, from now on, from here forth, Native Hawaiians will be A, 50% blood quantum, B, a descendant of those that were here when Captain Cook landed, and 3, an American. C, an American. That's the fishiest part. I always wondered why we were defined by statute. But I believe now that it's to cover up the lack thereof. Just like the statute had an annexation that never existed. Just like the resolution is being called a treaty and it's a unilateral municipal statute, which is totally different. Just like holding a plebiscite to pretend like democracy was afforded to people when Hawaiian subjects were not allowed to vote unless they denounced their queen, and Number two, because we didn't engage in our act of war, we are officially occupied by the United States, who did engage in acts of war against us. And so every day their presence is here is an act of war. Them arresting our queen was an act of war. Them landing their soldiers' boots touching the ground is an act of war according to international law. A military just showing up in your country without permission, that's an act of war. So Hawaiians have maintained the higher ground here legally, and I hope that one day these truths will be recognized with justice. So what is, how, in like one sentence or less, I guess, is a good way to put it. How would we describe the political status of the Kingdom of Hawaii? Okay, I'm going to try. I haven't even practiced this, but I don't know if I can. But it's an unlawful military occupation, prolonged and ongoing. That's the political status of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Unlawful military occupation, prolonged and ongoing. That's the shortest I can put it. There's more to it. So what are the subjects of the Hawaiian Kingdom? What is their political status? Yeah, we got to go to each one. Well, we're pretty much taken hostage in our own land. Basically, we have nowhere to go. We don't have, Japan has, the Japanese have Japan, the Chinese have China, the Americans have America. Like, so we are political prisoners within our own land, which is a very strange position to be in. I hope that clears it up, and I hope you can at least say that I've explained. And if not, please ask questions. But I'm hoping to have explained what exactly makes Hawaii occupied, what exactly makes us political exiles in our own country, and why we're an unlawfully occupied country, why it's unlawful. So why it's unlawful is because there's no treaty. Why we're political prisoners in our own country? Because we've never voted on this. Why have we never voted on this? Because the plebiscites that they held internationally, according to international law, is illegal for them to hold, so don't count as plebiscites. Yeah, so that's a shortcut to the political disposition of Kanaka Oiwi. And I state that genocide is occurring because according to the laws of genocide, which is decided by the United Nations, denationalization is considered genocide. And we have been denationalized to believe that we are part of America. We have been denationalized because we have been coerced to denounce our nation and our sovereign. We have been committed genocide against because one of the articles of genocide say that if you take away people's ability to make food, ability to live, that's genocide as well. So the 1.4 million acres being held against our will as a fake trust constitute that taking away of resources, that making homelessness a thing. That so it's hard to get people, especially Kanaka, who have been through this for generations and have accepted, if it looks like a duck, it must be a duck. Kind of attitude. And even if they do know the details of how we are unlawfully occupied, how this great injustice continues to exist, how it's prolonged and continuing every day and today, right now, I think to survive, a lot of them just said, I'm just going to pay attention to surviving, and that's how I think we've been able to get by without sending our children in to crowded areas with suicide bombs on them, like the rest of the sane world would do facing a genocide. As horrible as that sounds, that's the natural reaction of the rest of the world is to fight back. And we fought back legally, but not physically. And I'd like to see that continue, but I don't know if it can if we do pursue our justice and our emancipation. But I think it can also, on the other side of that, why I think it can continue peacefully is because of our culture, because Hawaiians know that every people in the world are here for a specific reason. Yeah. And Hawaiians believe that reason, most of them, to be to teach the world aloha. And I don't know if through aloha we can get back what is being stolen from us every day. But I can tell you that, like, there's been successes because America, again, knows of its crime and the criminal acts that constitute that crime. Like Bumpy Kanahele got land back under his name, but that land belongs to some other poor Hawaiian or to the Kingdom of Hawaii. But that's a win for people that have the bar so low because of the stigma of being Hawaiian, the stigma of speaking the language, the stigma of being a national Hawaiian royalist is huge among Hawaiians and between the cultures. But I believe that the truth will always overcome and that no injustice can live forever. And I think if more foreigners and Americans knew exactly why and how Hawaii is an unlawfully occupied country, exactly why and how Hawaiians are undergoing a genocide, exactly why and how injustice is being maintained every day, I believe that we could get change. We can have change happen. Our land titles, thank God, are upheld in the courts because our would-be thieves tried to quiet title our land from the Mahele, right? It was originally 7,000 acres. And not just with my family. It was a bunch of families got together and I guess they called it a co-op. They purchased this large tract of land, 7,000 acres. When the lava flows came down the mountain in Kona and chased most of the Hawaiians away, a lot of them moved to Oahu because otherwise you weren't making any money. You know, Hawaii was just becoming industrial and being in the country was poverty. So they moved to Oahu. Well, those that were allowed to lease their land at one point, because Hawaiians didn't just lose their land because they were ignorant of land deeds, I found out, not in my family, and not in a lot of families that do their research and find out. We're told that as part of the stigma. It's part of our occupied mentality of what a Native Hawaiian is. Native Hawaiian is also a person who thinks that their ancestors lost their land because they were ignorant about land laws. That is the furthest from the truth as it can be. The Hawaiian Kingdom was a sovereign kingdom for almost 100 years, about 90 years, 80 something, I think. And during this time, like, my kupuna and elders were meticulously creating land deeds, rewriting leases, renting out like real estate brokers. Basically, they knew exactly what the metes and bounds of all the land they were leasing out, of the extent of the contract, and they also knew that according to the kingdom law and according to the state law, because state law takes precedence to kingdom law, that what was written in the land deed was a legal document, was a legal statement. So some of the things written in land deeds included the fact that these lands were inalienable. What does that mean, inalienable? Well, that means it could never be alienated from you, never be taken. And how did they protect this or make that happen? Well, the original land deed holder, the royal patent owner, got their deed straight from the king and queen. The king, I should say, and then the queen later. And in the contract, it says that forever and ever shall the land remain in the bloodline, basically is what it translates to. So that if I had leases written out in my lifetime for people that I trusted to lease the lands, when I died, those leases become moot. They no longer count. The land returns back to its original state, and that's how it was meant to stay in the family forever and ever. You cannot sell it, in other words. You can sell it with a unanimous agreement, but when you have 77 people owning one portion of land, the original intent, which was to keep it in the family, prevails. The only way that land was taken from us was through quiet title, which is a insidious law. Hawaii has the most complicated land laws in the so-called United States. And that's because clear title is clouded for every single land deed in all of Hawaii. Every single one, maybe except Pearl Harbor. But maybe not Pearl Harbor because it was supposed to be returned 70 years after the contract of reciprocity, the Treaty of Reciprocity, which gave the United States Pearl Harbor. That was the only legal part that they ever had legal access to. But of course, 70 years have passed. It has not returned to the Crown and government lands. Now, just to make it clear, Crown and government lands are called ceded lands, which is a lie. A cessation creates ceded lands. A cessation requires, without it, you cannot have it. It requires a treaty. Doesn't exist. The treaty doesn't exist. The people never consented. That's why you hear them say, show me the treaty. I think that's why when we block the road and we're committing civil disobedience, that they cannot just round us up and throw us in Guantanamo like they do to a bunch of other people without any charges and in prison without any knowledge why. It's because how can you take the people who are the clear title owners of the land and arrest them for being on their land? So they're stuck in a rock and a hard place legally too, no matter how hard they try to falsify a treaty and meets and bounds, because we're still here. We still enjoy the right of clear title ownership to the lands. Everybody recognizes these as Hawaiian lands. Like, what happens when you have land, you and your husband or you and your wife have lands, and you two pass away and you don't have a will, right? What happens is the land gets distributed equally to the direct next of kins. Yeah. And that's only after a court case. That you have to get that decided in a court case. But that's what happens. That's the law. If you're an heir to assets from your parent, they go to the next of kin. Yeah. Well, what happens to a country then when the head of state is deposed? Wait, let's start all over. What makes a country? Yeah, a head of state, a governing body like let's say a parliament or a legislature, and 3, the people. Yeah. So our head of state has been deposed. She's died. The office is being occupied by the federal government, and the assets have been taken over by the federal government as well, and the state. And what happened to our legislature? Well, can you hear me? Jeez, how long have I been out? Because I just noticed now. I've been talking this whole time. Oh my gosh. This is terrible. Sorry. Awesome. Mahalo for being here too. Well, that's a great question, and I'm glad you're asking that question. No matter who we are and who we descend from, we are privileged to what our ancestors were privileged to in some way or form. Some of us might have inherited assets. Some of us might have inherited culture. There's other things to inherit too, inherited the love of your family before you, or inherited the opposite of that sometimes, unfortunately. But I think we start first by realizing that, when you're in a position of privilege, you might not think you're in a position of privilege. But if you can have democracy, if your land titles are all in good form and you're in control of them, if you can practice your own religion and bury yourself how you want to be buried, then you are privileged already compared to a Native Hawaiian. So I'm not trying to make you take the blame for your ancestors, but I think we should take responsibility as much as we can, and that's what you're asking. So I really appreciate that. Because Native Hawaiians are also still learning about this. They're still, some of them aren't even on the fence yet as to deciding on this. Some of them ignore it completely as a waste of time and futility because that's how we've been conditioned. First of all, we need the time to acknowledge the truth, to come to the truth, to debate the truth. So you see a lot of confusion. You see a lot of different factions now standing up and claiming to be Hawaiian. The best way to support them, I think, is to encourage the positivity, encourage a positive way of engaging in this. Is to listen to their what they have to say. Ultimately, though, I'm not going to sugarcoat it for you. All the land we sit on is in lack of clear title. Title guarantee exists to ensure the fact that your title is clear, doesn't it? And they're the insurance for that. So eventually, if we ever get to a point of justice, and settlers have a hard time hearing this because they say this to me all the time. What do you expect us to do? Give it all back? Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know who owes you money? Title guarantee. They insured your title. That's not our problem. So I'd like to put that out there too. Like, it's not our problem. They got the insurance for that. That's what they exist for. They're going to compensate you for their wrong. You see, in an ideal world. So getting to that, to support a sovereign Hawaiian nation. Yeah. How do we support that? Well, not by falling for the propaganda of the Department of Interior trying to make us Native American tribe. No, because if you look at the evidence of that, all the Native Americans that have fallen for Department of Interior federal recognition are on the worst parts of their land with no subsistence. The water sometimes is polluted and filled with oil. They may seem to benefit from these casinos, but are they maintaining their language? Are they maintaining their culture? Or are they prone to alcoholism and a life of waste with all that opportunity to make money? Yeah, so I would ask that you support conscious, educated groups seeking sovereignty. How do you know if they're conscious or educated? Well, you got to be conscious and educated yourself. And it sounds to me like you are. So supporting that kind of group, being understanding of the turmoil of Hawaiians. Imagine if you woke up one day and you were an American and all your land was taken. And that was the tough shit tits you have to deal with. Yeah, excuse my language. You know, if the Palestinians strap bombs upon themselves and run into crowds because of that same reason. I mean, all over the world, people fight to the death for the same things that Hawaiians are deprived from. So recognize that aloha that we've had for generations. Nurture that aloha that we've had for generations, because I believe in it. I know some people believe in war and being combative. Yeah, in debate I can be combative and whatnot, but I think we are here to teach the world aloha, the spirit of aloha, the real aloha. And that can only come from a real place, like that kind of movement that we're trying to have. We're trying to have a kapu, what they call a kapu aloha, and I hate using that term, kapu aloha, okay? It's neither kapu nor is it aloha. They're trying to say peaceful resistance, so let me say that, a peaceful resistance. I call it kapulu aloha, but never mind, that's something else. They want to have kapu aloha. That's what they call it now, this peaceful movement. I encourage that. Encourage that there's a solution, like to give back assets. If you invested in assets that were stolen and you were forced to give it back because the law changed all of a sudden, take it in stride and understand that title guarantee will be forced to compensate you. That should be a minor inconvenience as opposed to somebody having to accept the genocide of their people. I explained earlier that you might not have heard how it's a genocide. Yeah, there's specific rules and laws that make it a genocide. The fact that our nation, our nationalism has been reprogrammed, and we've been brainwashed to think we're Americans. We've been legislated to think we're Americans. And so there's just this big wall. Help in any way you can, like support conscious and educated movements. If you're privileged to, if you're privileged to have that kind of way to support another person, I would say do it. Like if I had the resources, I would be funding something to that measure. I'm not saying that that's what everybody should do. We also know that prayer really makes a big difference. It changes the vibes and the energy in the air. It supports movements that otherwise wouldn't have succeeded without prayer. I know because I was on Mauna Kea and we received those prayers that people sent from their mountaintops at the same time that we collaborated to do a worldwide prayer, basically prayer hour. And you could feel it change. So I'm not asking you for things, although if you have the things, please, by all means, locate. I don't think we're talking about it at that level. As a regular everyday person, how you can support, being an open ear, learning about it, learning the facts about it. If something doesn't make sense, learn about it until it does make sense. Go keep learning about it till it does make sense. Like, if you're not putting together how Hawaii is an unlawfully occupied nation for a fact, then ask me, and I'll tell you, because there's no treaty. Treaties are required for cessation. Treaties are required to become a state. No treaty exists. That's the simplest way I can put it. Is support the facts and learn and learn. Yes, that was the advent of land ownership. Hmm. Hmm. Yes, they did have their chance first. Yes, it's falsely called ceded lands because that's what they taught us, but it's never been ceded. Mhm. Yes, Kumu. That's a great question. Um, I consider it, according to international law, completely unlawful. Yeah, because those lands were never conveyed to the entity that now exerts ownership rights over it. Although at the same time speaking out of the other side of their mouth, this is the state of Hawaii, that they're holding it in trust for us. Yet, a trust is only made when the beneficiaries of a trust convey that land into the trust. Never happened. So initially, they stole the land, they're a thief, and they're handling the land how they wish. And some things they're trying to do is dismantle the laws that protect these lands, because these lands are supposed to stay in perpetuity. Portion of it, there are two portions: the government lands, which the legislature of the Hawaiian Kingdom or the legislature of any government that had these lands would have authority over. Not to sell, but to manage for the government. Yeah, they could lease it out, they could build on it themselves, they could make agriculture and make money off of the land, but they cannot sell it. And the second portion of land is the crown lands. These two portions, the government and the crown lands, make up 1.4 million acres. Crown lands went with the office of head of state. Yeah, it wasn't the personal property of the head of state. It was also considered government property. Um, Let me see here. Forcing land from leasehold to fee simple is unlawful and illegal because the land deeds specifically state that these lands are to be held in perpetuity, inalienable lands. What does inalienable mean? It means it could never be alienated from you, from the entity that owns it, which is the government, and the head of state. Mhm. No, they were never fee simple. They were created as like temporarily would an entity be in charge of that land, and none of those entities, when they left the office, would be able to take that asset with them. It stays with the office. So the crown lands stay with the head of state. The government lands stay with the legislature or the parliament. They're the same. Crown, yeah, crown and head of state lands, I'm sorry, are the same. Yes. Yes. Yes, I am. And the king decided to do this upon his own will, so he divested himself of authority as an absolute ruler over all of the land, for fear that his subjects would get taken over by a larger country and not have rights to the land legally, because that's what the Thomas Square event is all about. Yeah, the British came and took away the sovereignty of Hawaii for almost a year. Well, a British captain came on behalf of the Britons of Britain, and when he went back to Queen Victoria to present her this new land that he acquired and stolen from the king, he occupied it with his worship. She was a just woman and returned the kingdom back to Hawaii in our first recognition internationally of our sovereignty. So back, yeah, yeah. Ah, okay. I see what you're asking. So the Kamehameha Dynasty, now, land ownership doesn't begin until 1848 when Kamehameha III enacts the Mahele, right? So I think you're talking about the lands that the Kamehameha Dynasty held before the Mahele, that they continue to hold after the Mahele. Now, they held private lands as well as, when they were in office, controlled the crown lands. So these are separate lands that I'm talking about. It would depend where that particular tract of land goes to, whether it goes to the crown lands or it goes to private ownership under a Kamehameha. Now that is private land ownership. If they had a land deed that said all the metes and bounds of this land and was approved by the government, then they had private land after that. The only government lands are the ones designated as crown lands and designated as government lands. So it would be a very specific case, and I'll look that up for you so I can tell you next time. But Molokai Ranch you're talking about, yeah? And the Kamehameha lands. So so we cannot assume that all the Kamehameha lands were crown lands, for example. But I can see how that could easily be assumed. We'd have to look at the land titles, because they had, like Princess Ruth, what she bequeathed Bernice Pauahi Bishop, were private lands that they had acquired before the Mahele and kept after the Mahele. It shouldn't be any crown lands in that booty. If it is, then that's unlawful for them to sell crown lands. So if you know for a fact that these are crown lands and not Princess Ruth's personal lands that she claimed in the Mahele as herself, not her office, then she doesn't have an office. But then you might have an argument, a legal argument that says that those lands were unlawfully sold, because they should never be sold, crown and government lands. Mhm. Princess Ruth? Yep, yep. The only concern I would have that might be an issue is if the land deeds stated that the land was inalienable. Yes, I am. Can you hear me? Hello? Hello? I'm here now. Hello? Oh, there it is. I heard your question, Kumu. Sorry I got knocked out again. So I would, that's a good question. I would look at the land deeds, because land deeds stipulated whether the land was alienable or inalienable, whether the title was allodial or non-allodial. Allodial titles are inalienable. They are required to go back to its original meets and bounds. The land is required to go back to its original meets and bounds. So whoever's leasing it, because they cannot sell it, has to give it back when the leaser has died, because now it goes to their descendants. And that's how we guaranteed for time immemorial that our descendants would have land. And that's supposed to be upheld by the state of Hawaii according to their own statutes, which in the first paragraph refers and gives precedent to Hawaiian kingdom law. And this is Hawaiian kingdom law. It would say in the leases whether the land was allodial or non-allodial, meaning inalienable or alienable. Were you able to sell it or not sell it? You're not able to sell it if it states explicitly that it's supposed to return to the descendants. I've never found one that was alienable. I never found one that was non-allodial. Maybe for the Maka'ainanas they had non-allodial sometimes, and for the Haulis definitely non-allodial, because it was expected that the land, and it was maintained by law and enforced, the land goes back to its original meets and bounds and its original owners, who would be the heirs or the royal patent holder himself or herself. I hope that helps. Depends on the land deed, and that depended on who you were. If you were a foreigner, you would have non-allodial land title given to you. If you were a business, it would be non-allodial as well. If you were not the royal patent owner or their descendants, it was non-allodial. If you were a royal patent holder or a descendant of a royal patent holder, that's the best land deed you could ever have in Hawaii, because it's the first land deed ever. That's all land deeds take precedent from that clear title. And if you were a royal patent holder or a descendant of a royal patent holder, the deed would say that the lands would be held by your folks in your bloodline forever and ever, as designated by who? Through the deed. Royal patent owner. But now we're talking about a trust. Yeah, Kamehameha Schools and Bernice Pauahi Bishop putting her cousin's lands all into a trust. The trust stipulated, and the trust was created in the kingdom time, that none of the land is to be sold. State of Hawaii had to make one law that forced lease to fee conversion, and that's illegal. That's unlawful. It's international laws being broken. So no land should leave the original total in those cases that you're speaking. Yeah, they absolutely have a seal, a traditional seal with wax, and it's stamped in with the king's name. If not the king himself or the queen herself, then the representative of the king or queen, the kuhina nui. It's official. It's documented in their records. That's what the Bureau of Conveyances is made out of. That's where the basis of land tenure in Hawaii starts, with those deeds, original of which is stamped with the royal insignia. And it's done with red wax. I've seen it. It's on a piece of paper and it's embossed. It's like old style stamping. So yes, Malsi, good question. That's an awesome question, and there's a lot of confusion because there's this red, gold, and green flag that you see sometimes, right? And there's all these other flags you see that kind of look like the Union Jack, the British Union Jack, or the state flag, but are a little bit different. There were flags for heads of state that kind of resemble the Union Jack as well, like that were flown when they were present. Their own personal flags, like when Liliuokalani was riding her carriage, her flag and her symbol flew next to the Hawaiian Kingdom flag. The Hawaiian Kingdom flag is and was the flag with the British Union Jack on top of it. Now, you do see it as a symbol of colonialism. Let's do that right. Because we know, we have a perspective that is 2020 hindsight. We knew what they were doing now. They were colonizing it. They were imperialistic. Sorry about the noise. Nanakuli. But to the Hawaiians, the British didn't come to colonize Hawaii. One did, Admiral, I forget his name, but Admiral Thomas comes and replaces the sovereignty of the Hawaiian kingdom when this one British captain is pissed off, right? He's wondering why he can't own land. Well, you can't own land in a foreign country when you're not a native or a citizen. And Hawaiian kingdom was no different. But he threw a fit, and the king was away, traveling around the islands, taking care of his people, doing his duties. Yeah, and meeting up with his people all around the islands. And so when he arrives in Honolulu, the crown and the seat of government looks basically empty. He proceeds to take his warship and occupy the kingdom of Hawaii first, before America did. For almost 10 months, he sits in deprives the king and the Hawaiian people of governing themselves and sovereignty. He's confident that when he brings Hawaii back home to his Queen Victoria, that he'll be rewarded and lauded, right? Well, he does go back to Queen Victoria, and Queen Victoria turns out to be a really just ruler. Like, she knew international law, and she knew that Great Britain was in violation of the international law by invading a peaceful country and taking the seat of their sovereignty. So she returns the sovereignty of the Hawaiian people to Kamehameha III. And this is recognized as our day called La Ku'oko'a. It's November 28th. It's a kingdom holiday. It's our Independence Day. Because our independence was recognized, it was reinstated and recognized by Great Britain. But the first treaty to put Hawaii on the international stage as a sovereign country comes from that, from Great Britain and France jointly recognizing the sovereignty, the right to rule, and the right to exist of the Kingdom of Hawaii. Back to the flag. This is how the flag became what it was, why it's the Union Jack. And I know this because it was printed in around 1819 in the Hawaiian language newspaper. It was on the first page of this newspaper. I think it was Ku'oko'a, was the name of the newspaper. And it was the first color print in a newspaper in the world. And the color print was of this exact flag that we see, the state adopted as the state flag. And the story goes that Kamehameha was trying to trade his sandalwood in China or something like that, in a port in China. But they weren't accepting anybody. Like, they were pretty much going to shoot on sight anybody who arrives in the country to trade without diplomatic means. And you'd have to have a flagship, a ship with a flag, to go into these ports and to trade. Kamehameha didn't have one. He went all the way to China, and what they did was they took all his goods and sent them back empty-handed because he didn't have a flag. The royalty of Hawaii, at that time, we had a great high opinion of the British. They had restored our sovereignty. They had not come to colonize us. They have not taken anything from us. They were greatly admired because they had royalty as well. Yeah, so the Hawaiians respected that more than a president, for example. They admired that. They admired her just actions, Queen Victoria, and the elegance of royalty. So in order to not be robbed again of his trade, Kamehameha the First adopts the Union Jack and emulates Great Britain because he greatly admires them. And ever since then, it's been the Hawaiian Kingdom flag. We've never experienced colonialism or imperialism from Great Britain, except for that 10 months when the British captain took away the sovereignty of the nation, which was restored by Queen Victoria. So you can see how that plays out historically as like a good experience for the Hawaiians with the British. In fact, a great experience with the British, and we don't have that kind of experience that Africa has with the British in particular. So that Union Jack doesn't represent colonialism to subjects of the Hawaiian kingdom, knowing the history of that. And this history is true because, and this is why I think it's true, it was written in a newspaper in 1819, a couple years after Kamehameha I dies. Everybody that was around during Kamehameha's rule, the first, could have disputed that claim. And oftentimes in Hawaiian newspapers, it was like social media. Like they would respond like, "No, you're completely wrong and you're a liar." They would really fight it out in these newspapers if something wasn't true. Tons of people would write in and brandish whoever wrote that misspeak. And nobody, not one person did in all the years that the Hawaiian language newspaper existed till like 1930s. From 1840 or so, no, from 1819 to about 1930s or 40s, we had about 100 syndicated Hawaiian language newspapers. We were the most literate people in the world. And not one person wrote in to dispute that front page claim of the first color newspaper in the world of the Hawaiian flag story. And that tells a lot. And knowing that people who were his closest advisors were still alive at that time, if not, their children were still alive and they knew the stories. So I trust that information completely. And I think it's well vetted. So if that answers your question, I hope it does. Yeah. Thank you. And Thomas Square exists as a memorial to that event. Thomas Square downtown, the park. Just another tidbit. I think we have to look at what it is first, and that's subjective sometimes and objective as well. Like, what are we looking at exactly? We're looking at all these different groups pop up and claim to be a representative of the kingdom. I don't know how you can be a representative of a constitutional monarchy without being appointed by the people. First of all, according to the Constitution, the last Constitution that was ratified by the Hawaiian Kingdom. Now there's some fight about what should have been the Constitution, but I'm talking about what was the Constitution and what is that Constitution. Yeah, not what could have been that Constitution and what should have been that Constitution. So people have problems with the Constitution that was enacted, but the Constitution that did exist is very specific as to what a Hawaiian Kingdom subject is, or who a Hawaiian Kingdom subject is. It's very specific as to what lands a subject owns and what land a subject... ownership is not even the word. Stewards. What lands a subject stewards and what lands a subject does not have kuleana with. It's very specific. It's not blood quantum based. It's not blood based at all. Hawaiian Kingdom subjects are the heirs to the Hawaiian Kingdom today. Not just Hawaiians. And I think if we got that message out, we'd have more allies. But the divide and conquer rule has been prevalent. So that descendants of the Hawaiian Kingdom, like the Japanese descendants, the majority, the Korean descendants that exist today, the Filipino descendants, the Portuguese descendants of royalists. That means people that were in good standing with the Hawaiian Kingdom as subjects and not like considered, what do they call that when you become, not considered foreign or having been made stripped of your kingdom subject rights. Yeah, so legal kingdom subjects and their descendants are the descendants of the Hawaiian Kingdom today, that whose rights are being deprived, whose assets are being controlled by the occupying government. What I see today is confusion, but I see clarity coming through at the same time. People are trying to learn the disposition, like exactly what are they claiming, yeah? Most times it ranges from because, that's why, because, and to there's no treaty, this is the land deed, this is clear title. Like there's a big gap between just somebody saying because, and somebody telling you there's no treaty that exists. This is not clear title. This is my, it says right here, it's inalienable. It says right here that the United States is supposed to uphold the Hawaiian Kingdom precedents. Those are specific. Yeah, I think we need to be more specific, but a lot of people have decided that they cannot learn it. It's too much for them. They just want to talk on a spiritual level. I see that. I mean, I'm in the Hawaiian spirituality group, so I'm not talking like to be disrespectful, but when we're looking for hard facts and evidence, and they're holding a hearing where they got 6 questions they said they're going to ask you, and if you don't answer them, they're going to consider that as a yes. And you show up at these meetings, and the first thing I hear is you like give them your mana'o. You know what is the difference between mana'o and ike? Absolutely, right? And I love mana'o. I love it to death, but it's working against us at these Western hearings, because most times somebody with their mana'o not going to answer the 6 questions, even though it says they're going to count you as an yes if you don't answer the 6 questions, and they wonder why. So education, I think it takes self-education. It takes yourself to be responsible for clearing up exactly the path that you're trying to say is the reason why this is an injustice. There's like bothersome things that occur to me, and I'm not putting down these people who are part of the group. I'm just going to say it because it's true. Like the nation of Atui bases their whole thing on Kauai being its own kingdom and still having rights to be a kingdom. Well, actually, according to international law, you kind of don't have rights. You've been conquered fair and square and absorbed by the Hawaiian Kingdom. So it just divides us more when a faction of us is going off for rights that they think they deserve but really have no basis, and breaking us into smaller groups. So that's where it can be detrimental. So I think we all need to learn more. We have to take it upon ourselves. Atui, if you look in the history, is a misnomer that was printed by a map maker that was a haole. So like the word Atui doesn't even have any other origin than what that haole wrote down and was a misnomer. And so that's just sad to me. Yeah, like I just wish there was a way to make them want to look at the facts, But that takes away from our collective stance when we get one person saying all these belligerent things that sound passionate, but they have no basis, and then you have somebody telling you international law, the facts, I guess, objective things, and it just makes the whole movement look a little bit messy. But we shouldn't care about how we look. We should care about how we're progressing to be more and more together. And I think certain groups volunteering representation of my kingdom rights that never asked me are invalid, completely invalid. You don't have the support of the majority of the constituents, the subjects. You can be a temporary, I guess, representative, but we never ask you to do that either. So I'm very suspicious of people that one, step up to the plate, which I can't be suspicious of. I give them credit for that. But two, pretend to represent a right that is mine and that I gave no permission for them to represent. So there's the infighting too when that occurs, because you don't want nobody representing you. You don't even know them, and they're over there speaking like, "Oh, you're my kingdom's military. Oh, you're my kingdom's representative. Since when?" I think that's a failure on our part, or on the part of those that think they're trying to cross all their T's and get that support. Yeah, I see a lot of confusion. I see a lot of mystifying of the facts. Like it's like a mythical industrial machine, Hawaiian culture, Hawaiian history, and who is a Hawaiian. It's almost like a fairy tale, every story. We really got to break it down to the truth. Like, yeah, I feel like all kinds of things. I can tell you, if I can just say this. It's gonna sound rude, but this is what my kupuna taught me. Mana'o is like an asshole. Everybody has one. We want your ike and your knowledge. Yeah. I know you love this place. Now they know you love this place. But what about the 6 questions you're not going to answer because you feel like your mana'o is keeping us back? That kind of stuff. And I think we need to have a room for mana'o, but I think we need to know where and when to apply that. And I see that a lot in every single meeting. That's the most disparaging part. It's almost like we're afraid to say the truth instead of the mana'o. The mana'o is the story, the mana'o is the mo'olelo, the mana'o is the feel good or feel bad or feel my pain and then feel good after. But the ike is no treaty, no cessation, no such thing as ceded lands, no such thing as the state giving you something that belongs to some other royal patent owner or the crown and government lands and acting like you did something special when really you just received stolen lands and continued the theft. There's that. You know what I mean? I've seen that happen too, where the state is offering leases out to problematic Hawaiians that stand against them, and I give them plenty of credit for standing against them, but do we ever think for a second whose land you stealing instead? Where does that land come from and why the state is giving it to you? We got to think about those kinds of things. So it's a big mess, but I think we're a lot further along today on the same page because of our confusion. At a certain point, you can only go solo and then we're going to start going up. Yeah, and I think we started going up when the Department of Interior came and proposed the so-called question of making us an Indian tribe under the Department of Interior. In other words, finally getting that conveyance with the meat and bounds that they don't have now because it's stolen. And that's what that is. Yeah, the Department of Interior is relinquishing, is alienating our inalienable rights. We couldn't even do that if we wanted to, but if we believed it and if we didn't take action upon it, that's the danger. Yeah, like inalienable rights is inalienable. Yeah, but not if the people believe that they've been alienated from these rights and they act accordingly. And that's what we're getting to. We're getting to acquiesce. If we're not challenging the inalienableness of our inalienable rights. And we're just agreeing to the fact that, oh, that's what it said. The DOI said in one advertisement before they had it. They had the convention, the con, or whatever they called it. I went with other people, but I was there. They stated that you would lose the right for your descendants and all time after if you didn't participate, which is completely untrue. But people not knowing any better believe that, yeah, and it's the belief in it that's going to make it true. Like, if people believe that they don't have rights, they're not going to stand up and fight when that right is compromised. They're going to think they alienated their inalienable rights, which is completely nuts. Like, that's what they're talking about. You mean you're telling me we alienating inalienable rights? And yeah, that's what they told. That's what they was telling us. They're trying to get us to believe that's a thing, like that can even happen. But it can only happen when we all believe it. I think I got cut off, huh? But I hope that answers your question. It's confusing, but we gotta have patience, and we gotta educate each other. We gotta make each other want to learn from each other. We cannot talk to each other like in a manner that doesn't engender the person to receive the information. And I've had problems with that in the past, because I don't care before. Like, I don't care if I know something that is true, but we have to care, because we want the ears of not just fellow Hawaiians, and I say Hawaiians not in the ethnic form, but as kingdom subjects, which is how the kingdom used the word Hawaiian too, as well as Kanaka Uivi, to teach and learn from each other. So if I burn a bunch of bridges, people would want to listen to me. At least I can, like, I have to think about other ways. Yeah, at least I can teach other people not to engender that kind of relationship, because we do need to learn from each other. We do need to be open-minded. Like, if I was a person of the nation Atui, I would ideally like to be a person that is willing to listen to the fact that it says Atui on that map, and we're calling ourselves Atui after a misnomer. What the hell is that? But not everybody is meant to cross all those bridges, yeah? So hopefully we can engender or create a culture where if I cannot do them, somebody else can go and do it, at least. And I think we're getting closer to that. I think we're starting to recognize what each of us can and cannot do, what each of us are good and not good at, and personally too, I'm starting to recognize that. But that's what I see us as today, as people who have gotten a sense of what the truth is, and it's starting to really internalize that, but we haven't internalized it yet. So some people are reaching out to any kind of groups that seem to represent some kind of need for sovereignty and some kind of need to feel like you're doing something. But I'm saying stop for it and be picky about who we affiliate ourselves with and why, and know the facts ourselves. Don't just leave it up to a guru or some leader to be able to speak for yourself that, hey, no more treaty, no more cessation. It's easy. Lands aren't ceded. The rights are inalienable. Prolonged and continuous. This is still a crime. I think that would speak. And I see the kids from the DOI meeting, Hawaiians watching each other lay out all kinds of knowledge and wisdom bombs from those testimonies was broadcasted throughout the state and throughout the world. And so we were teaching each other some of the things that I never know, like the meets and bounds. I never know about the meets and bounds, and I never know about inalienable and alienable and allodial and non-allodial. And I didn't know about the statutes of the state in its own law, supposed to take precedence to Hawaiian Kingdom law. So knowing all this now, when I go to testimonies, I make sure that I stick to the point. I make sure I read the intent of these testimonies and why they're holding them and what they're gonna do if I don't answer the questions, and what they're gonna do if I do answer the questions. This is just a time of, we live in an age of information. We live in an age of technology, and a lot of we Hawaiians walk around like we don't know. and then that we cannot know, and whatever, I get better things to do. Like, that's the mentality we've been force-fed, and that's the mentality that is prevalent today. But it's changing. I see the kids come up, and they're not sugarcoating it. They'll tell you they're not sugarcoating it, and they'll go down to all the things I said and tell you, and tell them, we want you to leave, to get the out of here. And that's a strong stance to take so young. So I have hope in the future generations. Am I still there? I hope that answers your question. Whoa. What? No. I have a Mac, and it usually runs really good, so I don't know what's wrong with it. Unless we have... I'm up to date. I'm up to date. Yes, my app is up to date. I don't know why it's doing that, Sorry. I did explain the answer to the question, so I'm sorry that nobody heard it, but it's... Oh no, I was answering the question about what do I see today, for Hawaiians, and okay. I think it absolutely matters. I, like myself, and from what I've learned and being participating in the process of this, Department of Interior federal recognition is an avenue, and I would fight to the death against that. It's the final nail in the coffin for the Hawaiian nation, as far as finally having some kind of legal instrument that conveys metes and bounds. It gives us the illusion of us being able to alienate our inalienable rights that go on from generation to generation, as far as land ownership and rural patents and allodial titles. And it doesn't really take away. It's crazy. I don't know if you heard me say it earlier, but alienating inalienable rights, that sounds fishy. That's like, what would be similar to that? Like, taking away a right that cannot be taken away. So how do you do that to a people? You convince them that they've alienated their inalienable rights, and then they don't stand up for it anymore. The generations following feel like their ancestors gave up that right because that's what they're told. But really, the truth is in the fact. It is in the word. It's in the title of the word itself. Inalienable is inalienable. Remind me again, what was your question? I hope I didn't go off too much. Scotty. Okay. from my small perspective, there's a large faction of people that have been brainwashed to go for Department of Interior federal recognition. One. The brainwash is, oh my God, we're going to lose everything and we're not going to have any rights. They're going to take them away and we need federal recognition. That's false. Our federal recognition is in the Hawaiian Homes Act. It's recognized by the federal government and promulgated by the federal government. It's a recognition like no other tribe in the whole world. If we go for Department of Interior recognition, that's a less of a recognition than we have now. That would be the final conveyance. So one faction is going for Department of Interior recognition. They want a race-based nation. They want to see reparations in their lifetime is the reason why, because they're impatient, because they want to see material things happen in their own lifetimes is the reasons I've been given from the people that are there. Another faction wants to resurrect Kauai's kingdom, which was never it was never internationally formally recognized, maybe a little bit by Russia, but it was, according to international law, fairly taken over in acts of war, mutual acts of war. That's important in international law. It's not like the Hawaiian Kingdom, who didn't engage in act of war, and only America did. That's how come a lot of our rights are preserved and our sovereignty is protected by the international laws, even if not in reality, in theory. And they don't have a basis in an international law or any kind of objective evidence to back up their claim. I see a lot of frustrated people there. I see a lot of people that don't learn. They're just going to follow whoever they trust. And the basis of Atui, again, is from a misnomer of a haole coming here and writing down Tauwa'i with a T, and seeing that as Atui. I can see that, and that's what's written down on top of the map, and so that's just kind of belligerent. And what do you expect from a belligerent occupation but belligerence? So I don't blame them, but I think we should all engender each other to open up and listen to the facts and the knowledge that each of us have to learn from. And I've been guilty of not being a person who other people are open to listening to. I mean, I've changed a lot since that time, but I didn't think it was important before, and I think it's so important now. There's other groups that occupy the palace, and that's their main job. There's another group that just camps at the palace. That's their main job. There's another group that makes little signs of people's names that protested against the annexation, and really they did a huge service to the generations ahead of themselves, us, by preserving our rights and protesting that annexation and beating that annexation, not having that annexation happen. Twice they did that. But all I see is the act of memorializing. And some people are some of these groups are afraid to make action, to go and put their bodies in the way for their liberty and their freedom and justice and their emancipation. And the people who don't like that confrontation seem to be drawn to these other groups that do nothing but make nice, pretty memorials about the truth about Hawaii, but won't take action. So, I mean, I'm not being... In Hawaiian culture, we don't even say this kind of stuff, yeah? Even with the hula, we don't say this kind of stuff. And so, I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I just want to put that out there. I don't think I would say to somebody to get over it. Not me myself. I mean, not with this topic. I can understand the grievances we still feel from Kamehameha's barbaric takeover of the Hawaiian archipelago and all the Kanaka that he killed and stole their sovereignty and stole their lands and reappropriated them, stole their women for his wives, so on and so forth. I think Kamehameha was definitely a man of his time. I think he, in his environment, this was the culture, the conquering chief culture. He wasn't the first, but he would be the last. I think I'm not to excuse him for his atrocities. Let's go over them. He won the first weapons and arms race in Hawaii. There was an arms race. When the Howleys came and showed them guns, the chief knew right away that he needed that for his army. Kamehameha knew right away that he needed to have that resource and monopolize that resource. Then he proceeded to shoot natives point blank in the face sometimes, like with Manono in Kuomo, that had sticks and stones for weapons and bones. You know, that's immoral and unethical. I don't think you should ever have to let go of that. I think Kamehameha was living in a kill or be killed world. At least he nurtured that, and that's what it was. Like, I think the time period that was the lifestyle where, you know, when chief falls in battle, his wives would run up behind and continue the battle, right, and get killed in the process, even if that's what happened. That we don't live in that world today. I find it hard to doing my genealogy. Let's go to that. I find out that I'm related to chiefs and people and regular people on both sides of the Kamehameha as a tyrant issue. On Kamehameha's side, on Kahekili's side. And so me, as a descendant of both of them, you know, you can pick and choose your ancestors you want to honor. But I think we got to just accept, point blank, it is what it is. Not let it go. We cannot hold the descendants responsible for what Kamehameha did, just as much as we can hardly hold the descendants of missionaries responsible for. I mean, the descendants of missionaries who were responsible for taking over the kingdom. But there is some responsibility involved. Like, I would expect proper respect for that ancient and historical past, which might not be so ancient to some, right? But I cannot speak for you. But aren't you related to both sides of the wars and the issues? And I think realizing that we cannot make up for the wrongs, really, of that generation. Like, what is the purpose of holding that hakaka inside you, or that namu namu inside of you? Is it to come to a solution, or will it just cause division? And then shouldn't we think about being descended from both sides of the issue? Even though Kamehameha, I agree, was an atrocity, and he was a tyrant. But after he conquered the islands, I guess, you know, the conqueror writes the history, because now he's benevolent, yeah. So I know what you're saying. I agree with you. He was a tyrant as well. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's amazing. Yes. Sorry. Wow. Mm-hmm. Aloha. Aloha, Brandon. How you doing? So well said. Kumu, if I may revisit, when you asked me if about what I think about the factors today, I hope that's what I was speaking to. Like today, I understand what you're saying, and thank you for reminding me about what was here before international law. It is important that sovereignty is evident, self-evident, and we should act as so and conduct ourselves as so. And I think you're right. So thank you very much. Mouthy. Right on. Mahalo to you. Mahalo, mahalo. Yes, aloha to you. Ooh. Ai, kala mai au. Yeah, keep mai au ya oi. I kala mai. What's raining hard, Bron? Kala mai. Wonderful. Trying to figure it out. Trying to figure it out. You should see I go all the way to 3 in the morning. Just trying to figure it out. I know. Calamai. Mahalo ku. So important. Thank you. All right. All right. I want to express my aloha to every single person here. I think just us being present, showing up, is already a solution. As much as the problems are wide and many, and I can talk about those for days. There's a lot of solutions happening, and I think the biggest solution to take away is learn as much as you can about the truth and understand the belligerents. Like, we got to embrace both some of the facts that we know. So I think when we have aloha for that, when we make mistakes, I think that's how we get forward faster. And don't expect ourselves to have to all agree on something for us to have our God-given right to be sovereign. No country in the whole world is on the same page about everything, and neither was the Hawaiian kingdom. If you look at the newspapers, division is a healthy people. Debate is a healthy people trying to figure out what is true. Don't be afraid of confrontation, and nurture belligerence, I guess. I mean, best you can. Mahalo, and thank you all. if you thank you for asking, Kumwen. We do, and Maki'ile sings beautiful too. What is it? Sign up for the club or follow the club, the Kani Kapila Club, and then when we open rooms, you'll know. You'll get notified. Yes, yes. Beautiful Hawaiian space. It was. Aloha. Aloha. Hello, aloha. That was awesome, awesome team. That was nice. I thought I thought I offended Lawrence for a little while, and I was like, oh no, like I never mean to do that, you know. Oh, Tanya's here. Let's invite her up. But I thought he wasn't offended. But when he was talking about Manao and Ike, I was full on in. You know, when you know when you get full on into it. Aloha, Tanya. Sorry. Yeah, sure. We just gotta unwind a little bit, you know. That was nice talking, nice winding up. Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. I love Brandon, but we've been in it before, like disagreeing, but we're still on the same team. You know what I mean? We agree more than we disagree. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was totally worried when Kum was saying, like, he didn't agree with me and stuff like that. I was like, oh, I was worried for a second because when I was talking, I wasn't thinking about the stuff he brought up. Like I was thinking about being in the moment. Yeah, like this Manao gotta go, and he's like, I'm all about him, all about Manao. What you talking about? Yeah, I didn't even know about speaking to that either. I didn't, but he's right. That is that part that we forget sometimes, that before days too, and before chiefs arrived. He's right. There was a community of aloha before they came and brought sacrifice and the priesthood and the chiefdom, and so in now, yeah, yeah, because yeah, absolutely. Oh, cool. Oh, Auntie Hope, yes, she's got awesome things to say. Tanya, where are you beaming in from? Awesome. Aloha, Auntie Hope. How are you? Aloha.